Thank you so much for this wonderful 3 talks that shed light on material contexts, material concepts, and material afterlives. So the floor is yours. We are very keen on receiving questions, statements regarding the presentations that you have listened to right now. Are there any questions that you have immediately? And our speakers are very willing to respond. We have a mic here. Is there a question? Okay.
Thank you also from my side for these talks. I have a question that maybe goes primarily to Robin Rehm, and that is about the distinction between the natural and the artificial. Because, all 3 talks were about distinction lines and how they were blurred or transgressed, engineering, architecture, design, or in your case, natural, artificial materials and all those properties with that. And I think maybe also in reflection of the final talk, where once again the question of natural materials and artificial materials is put quite differently by elevating them to certain kind of statuses. So I was curious what you would like to, if in the readings in the theory that you presented, what you would take from it as towards the history of this distinction.
Okay. If we have the differentiation of the nature material in mind, that this material consists about persistence and performance, or performance of persistence. We can read and we can understand a lot of topics which we know as Schlagwörter in the theory. For example, less is more. I think that less is more related to this distinction, this old distinction, because we have got more if we have less transformation in the material, in the nature material, because the nature material consists everything. Yeah? Less is more. If we think about Paul Klees' Aquarell, Bewegliches zu starren, we have concretely this kind of content of thinking. Less is more. If we move less, we have more. This is a kind of modern reflection about the problem of industrial material, because industrial material is a problem. And it is transformed by artistical ways. There are a lot of other distinctions and concepts which belongs to this very old view of natural material. For example, I want to give you another example, but I have to read the terms. The term of we all know in German, Tragen und Lasten, Tektonik. August Bötticher Gottfried Semper refers to that if he speaks about his publication, Der Stil, if he speaks from architecture of tektonische Künste. This, also Tragen und Lasten, load bearing and supported parts, tragende und lastende Teile. This distinction has, although a view to this old thinking of nature material, performance and persistence. The performance is tragen, and the persistence is beharren. Yeah? And this is, in a sense, the play, to find pictures in that we can think the problem of matter. Less is more, and tragen und lasten. I forgot always the words. Load bearing and supported parts. Excuse me, yeah. So, a long answer maybe.
Yeah, there's another question, and then I...
Hi, so I have a question for Kathleen. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask, because you hinted on this kind of transfer of knowledge between, I mean, yeah, your presentation was about transfer of knowledge between Germany, US, and US back, and I think this issue of architects like Gropius being inspired by US examples, or using those US examples rather than German examples. I wanted you to speak maybe a bit more, or if you have any kind of ideas why they did not refer to the local examples, or how, yeah.
I think this is partly a difference between avant-garde architectural interest and local engineering practice, and the US is exotic, and in particular the way that the US can be used as a new archaic or primitive. This whole literature first attracted my attention when I was trying to understand how Erich Mendelsohn had been educated in Munich, and that he had been almost certainly assigned to read some engineering literature by his professors that he was certainly had not mastered when he was designing the Einstein Tower, which had resulted in some of the problems that, as many of you know, only pieces of the Einstein Tower are built out of reinforced concrete as opposed to brick-covered stucco-covered brick because of those engineering problems. But he'd had this professor. He should have known better. And my suspicion, I won't speak so much for Le Corbusier, who had spent time in Germany, but probably had not, was never university educated in architecture, wouldn't have been assigned these things, but Gropius might have had an awareness of them through that kind of education, but that's not what interested them. I think what interested them was form rather than structure per se. Mies is a rather different example because he comes up through a construction background, not so much in the most modern materials, but nonetheless, although of course he also doesn't have university training, and I tried to pretty much leave him on the borders of this conversation because he thought much more intensively about construction to generate form than I think Gropius or Mendelssohn, or in this period of time, probably also Le Corbusier. I find it very interesting in knowledge transfer how much we have privileged the French, and it's interesting also to see again the Gideon book referenced, which is referenced since that book was republished more recently, is referenced constantly in the literature of concrete by people who assume that the German knowledge of the avant-garde in the 20s is coming from France. And that may be, but the German engineering knowledge is such that in the English-speaking world, you don't have acres of French publications on concrete being what survive in the engineering libraries. You have acres of books in German surviving in the engineering libraries. And I think it's interesting to me that for an architect like Pulzig really was aware, and Max Berg, this whole constellation of people in Breslau are clearly working very closely with engineering talent and innovative cutting-edge engineering. But the avant-garde architects of the 20s don't have quite that background. I think that having it come from America was more exotic, more archaizing, and they're trying to break with the culture here. And I think understanding also what they're trying to break with in Germany and the German establishment to some extent is really important. Those buildings in the United States, of course, as Rainer Banham pointed out many years ago in A Concrete Atlantis, weren't seen as avant-garde in the same way, don't inspire the same kind of architecture in the United States until the Germans start crossing the Atlantic again. But it fascinates me that, for instance, that Albert Kahn, Claire Zimmerman has just published a new very good book on Albert Kahn, and clearly there was nothing in the German engineering literature that Kahn ever missed. And that, and all kinds of people. The University of California, Berkeley, where I originally read a lot of this literature, was because Bernhard Maybach was bringing it all to the engineering school. Somebody who was fluent in German, but had also studied at the École in Paris before there is even an architecture school in Berkeley. And Julia Morgan, the first woman to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, and the first woman to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, her career takes off in California upon her return, not because of her training at the École, but because her expertise in concrete through her education and the engineering school at Berkeley enables her to design a structure that withstands the San Francisco earthquake very well, and she gets a lot of work based on her concrete expertise after that. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the expertise that German construction companies and engineers had, the global dissemination of that expertise, and then the ways in which it bounces back to people who aren't necessarily even aware that it's bouncing back, and would be less interested in it perhaps if they were aware of that.
Should I? Sorry, since I received the microphone much quicker. I'm gonna ask a question. Actually, my question is to all the three speakers, but maybe Kathleen and the third presentation we've heard here. It has to do with the media, because you talk about materials and material innovations, and materials are very concrete, they're very specific, as we can see, objects, but there are also representations of these objects, whether in trade literature, in magazines, in exhibitions, in different media events. So I wonder what happens when the materials are portrayed, what happens in this act of medialization of very concrete objects. And again, this is a perfect example right there. So yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, and I think in Kathleen's.
Well, I'll let the others talk as well, of course, but I found it very interesting that the materiality of these engineering books versus the Werkbund Jahrbuch, neither one gives you, I mean, the Werkbund Jahrbuch gives you very little material information. It gives you a picture of a building taken at a great distance in which the substance is quite abstracted. And on the other hand, the engineering literature gives you formula, gives you construction photographs, it gives you details, it gives you some of those same photographs of the buildings at a distance, but that's not the primary purpose. It's trying to instruct you on how to build in the same manner, or even better. And the materiality, as I think I tried to describe it, the books themselves is very different. They're clearly not part of an avant-garde publishing tradition. Typefaces all over the place, graphic design that would have appalled any good Werkbund member in 1906 or 8, let alone somebody who was studying here. The ways they convey information are visual, but in a totally different visual register. And you do get more of a sense of the materiality of concrete. You watch it being poured, but these are still all black and white photographs. I don't think that Gropius and Mendelssohn and Le Corbusier were at this point that interested at that fine-grained materiality of the material. They're interested in form, is my impression of it. And if you see Mendelssohn's wonderful drawings from the 19-teens, amazing sketches, but with the energy of the line coming out of Van de Velde, of course, rather than the representation of the material. Scholars still argue about when he was trying to use iron and when he was trying to use concrete in those. You could have a very a disagreement between experts very easily over which material is being depicted in parts of those drawings because there's not much specificity. It's the form and the ability to imagine new forms that's really breathtaking in those drawings, not the expertise of what concrete or iron can do. But I think one of the things that's really important to remember about concrete is that, first of all, fire safety. And there's lots of pictures in these of what happens if you have an iron building that burns and why you should have concrete instead. These concrete engineers are all really committed to concrete, but that's one reason. And the other is that it allows monumentality. And this building is an amazing building, but it's not monumental in the way that Max Berg's Centennial Hall, Jahrhunderthalle, was. And these engineers, they like monumentality. They're not as interested in what Albert Kahn or Gropius, or in that wonderful drawing of the concrete office proposition by Mies, which Dietrich Neumann has recently identified as probably being the work of somebody in Mies's office as a draftsman. They're not that as interested in that. I hope that helps, but the others, please.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions already here. So you are the first one, then
the
Kim,
others want to
and
answer,
then
but I have a question to for the last presentation, because the assemblage of this material was really awesome, and to have this archive of the original substance. And then I wondered, the achieving of new material like the staircase in Turton, how does it work? And I saw a little bit how it worked, and you didn't show any documentation of even there are these photos, but in the material collecting it, I saw the cordless drills, and I mean, if you don't document, or are there documentation of the original installation of these things, or even if of the process of reconstructing it, because I mean you lose a lot of information about the process of how it has been built in originally if you use the modern tools to to collect it and to rebuild it. I mean, you mentioned the pressure, and I know it, and I wonder how many original stairs there are in Turton, and if anybody knows how many original staircases there still are in Turton, and if a lot of information related to this material has been demolished with it. Now we have at least we have the material, but we don't have many informations inside that.
Yeah, thank you. I will try my best to answer. So as far as I'm aware, there are people who do know certainly how many staircases there are, and of course there's multiple kinds of housing typologies at the Turton settlement, all of which have different kinds of staircases. Certainly in this example, and the one that I showed, it was the second of its kind to be collected. They're big, they're heavy, that requires a large amount of logistics and resources in order to transport them. But the reason this one was collected was because it was in better condition to the other one that had been collected. So it was seen as a kind of more legitimate reference to save, you know. Taking these things, as I understood, is not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is for them to stay and remain in situ. What was interesting to me in observing the collection of that is, as you say, this staircase was damaged, you know, when it was brought into its new place, based upon those new tools that were required to reassemble it. Paintwork was sort of chipped off from the screws, and when rebolting. But I guess, as I understood it, that was like that was a, let's say, necessary evil in kind of preserving these objects. What's also true in that kind of dynamic is different players, different actors have a different agenda. You know, you only have 3 or 4 people to transport this, and you only have a day or 2 to do it. You can't risk the possibility of, let's say, storing it in parts and then leaving it, because then, in a way, it's very possible that one can forget how to reassemble it. So it has to be done quite quickly, and to reassemble these things, it was made of steel stringers and then timber runners and risers. It had caretakers who reassemble it, and they, you know, their requirement is to get it done. You know, like, it has to be reassembled. It has to be kind of, in a way, brought back to a kind of original condition. But that becomes one reference of many others. There is a book by Andreas Schwarting which shows the technical drawings of this staircase that I didn't show. And, you know, as far as I understood as an outsider and an ethnographer of those processes in the archive, you require different materials for different ways of kind of approximating an original. So the materials become associated with photographs, become associated with technical drawings. And I guess what you see in this ongoing process is that, like, it's not a kind of perfect and ideal and, like, kind of sort of purely original object. You know, these things require constant upkeep, constant maintenance, and negotiation with compromises. And I think through the method of the research, I tried to kind of show that. I just also want to answer the question about representation. It was really important, as far as I understand, material representation and how these materials become represented. I think through what I tried to show, it was that these materials, like, they are defined by the ways they're kind of represented, talked about, defined. And I think another aspect of the work which I tried to sort of show and work through is, especially in this kind of context of the climate crisis and climate change, and where often one looks for perhaps like techno-optimistic, or, you know, even in the kind of the contradiction of the Bauhaus as this sort of modern and progressive and technologically forward-thinking machine, is in fact today kind of, we are suffering the consequences of that kind of imaginary within the kind of economic social system we live. What was interesting for me is this work of preservation and the kinds of resources that are required, the kind of connections that are required between the archive, the city administration, homeowners, residents, presents a different kind of relationality where materials are valorized for their kind of being in the world. You know, the Bauhaus is one part of it, but there's another part, which is that these materials already exist. How do we represent them in a way that kind of communicates their existing value already? So, yeah.
Another question, Kim Förster. Do you have the microphone, Katja?
Kathleen, thank you very much for your presentation. I learned a lot about the transfer of the ideas of simplification, of construction, of monumentality. My question is, when at the turn of the century, Grosvenor Attenbury and Forest Hills used the first time concrete for prefabricated panel buildings. And then 20 years later, it was redeveloped or reinvented or transferred in Frankfurt and in Spanemann-Siedlung in Berlin in 1926. Have you found any concrete sources about a transfer of the idea that the materiality of concrete is fitting for the mass production of housing for these prefabricated panel buildings, which was then becoming very popular after World War II?
I have not. I have not gone out specifically looking for that, and I wonder if I did, what I would find. I need perhaps to... I reviewed all of the books I mentioned in a particular edition of them a long time ago and went back to some of them to write this paper, but I haven't been through all 15 volumes cover to cover in multiple editions to see exactly what's there. What I will say is that there are quite a number of concrete houses in the United States in the early 20th century that are in these books. They are not the panel construction, however, that you're talking about, and I do not remember, I'm quite sure I would have remembered if I'd seen Forest Hills in going back through those. But I was not going through the parts on housing as carefully as I should have, just for this particular talk, but if I'm publishing this, then I would, and if I were under slightly less pressure from a few other things I'm trying to do at the moment. My research project runs out the end of this year, and I retire, and then I have time for things like this. But definitely there's housing, and definitely that's something that really merits further investigation, because I wouldn't be surprised, and I would want to know more about what the panels, the history of the panel housing in Forest Hills was. Some of the a lot of the housing is from the New York area, and also one of the people involved in concrete houses, if I remember correctly, in the late 19th century is Thomas Edison, who's getting a lot of attention, obviously, for many other technical advances like the phonograph and the light bulb, which are being picked up in Germany very quickly and fostering whole industries in Berlin. So it's definitely something that's worth pursuing by one of us. You're welcome to it as your idea, but you've made me very curious.
Follow-up question for Simon and possibly for the archivists and the curators of those exhibitions. I was curious about this term that you used last, the minor practices, and wondered whether you could expand upon it, the politics of it, because you showed a lot how those objects became valued again, but also commented upon how users somehow didn't concern or couldn't concern less, and yet wouldn't, like, the notion of minor practices complicate somehow questions of maintenance and care. I was thinking of a similar term, minor planning, as used by Dubravka Sekulic at the RCA in London, who uses this term basically to reflect upon empowerment of underserved neighborhoods. And so where do you take this term, minor practices, from? And so wouldn't it be the practice need to be exhibited in the first place, or be entered into knowledge systems through sheets, or like whatever you showed?
Yeah. I mean, I would hope that the concept of minor practices complicates certain ideas, not only of maintenance, but also of history, and indeed how we conceive the very monumentality of, for example, the Bauhaus building. I think in the way I use this term, minor practices, it was not only connected to the kind of ethnographic position that I take, which is related very much to a grounded kind of day-to-day, everyday observation of the archive's negotiations of objects and things, you know, and just how much weight certain decisions can like have on the kind of overall life trajectory of an object, something that is saved, something that isn't saved, and the kind of decision making around that. I think it's also, I take this idea of minor practices as a way to kind of reflect back or challenge this sort of broader kind of UNESCO idea of the monument in a major history of progress. And I think in that regard, you know, there's a lot of controversy in that major history. You know, the Bauhaus sort of sits within what we now understand to be a kind of extractivist lineage. There is exploitation, there is kind of a sort of progress that separates nature and culture and doesn't necessarily explore the ideas of the consequences of that. And so I think within the minor approach, I've tried to understand more broadly how the Bauhaus as a monument is actually kind of grounded in the earth, in the decisions of everyday maintenance work. And from that kind of grounded position, I hope a sort of alternative historicity of the Bauhaus could emerge, through which its maintenance in the world is kind of understood through the kind of practices that I showed. So I hope that opens up to a different kind of possibility. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions, for the responses, and certainly also for the talks. So we are now continuing with the lunch break, and we meet us again at 1:30 here in the auditorium. If you have time during this 1.5 hours, you are certainly also welcome to visit the exhibitions that are still here in the building. So there's the exhibition on the research project on the famous glass facade, and there's also an exhibition on the last year's edition of the Bauhaus Lab that has dealt extensively also with the light bulb, after modern brightness, ecologies of light. So enjoy your lunch break and looking forward to the next session on the sort of architecture of construction industries. Yes, thank you.